to Module 7, which is intended for those who cannot make it to campus for the intensive weekend. What I want to do in this module is to give you the basis or a summation of the theology of the descent of Hans Urs von Balthasar. This is what we're going to look at on the on-campus intensive weekend. We are looking at the theology of Hans Urs von Balthasar, especially his theology of the descent of Christ into hell, and I will summarize that theology of Hans Urs von Balthasar in this module. In the next one, we're going to look at a book that's related to all of this, a book that he wrote, a book with the very provocative title, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved? So I will take up the themes of that book in the next module. In this module, I want to look at and give you an overview of the theology of the descent of Christ into hell according to Hans Urs von Balthasar. Okay, now who was this guy? Who was Hans Urs von Balthasar? Now I could give you all the dates, where he was born, some of the main formative influences in his life. But Bishop Robert Barron has a really fine video that does this for me. So let's watch this video clip from Bishop Barron. It's an introduction to Hans Urs von Balthasar, and after that clip that's going to play now, I will come back and we will take up the theology of the descent. So let's look at the clip from Bishop Barron right now.
Well, I want to tell you a little bit about a theologian who was very influential on St. Pope John Paul II. In fact, John Paul named him a cardinal of the church. Also a theologian who's a bit in the news today because he's associated with a certain controversial issue. What I want to do, though, is give a little bit background on him, who he was, and what his theological project was. I'm talking about Hans Urs von Balthasar. With Karl Rahner, the most important Catholic theologian of the 20th century. There's little question about that. Balthasar was born in Lucerne, Switzerland in 1905, so he's almost exactly the same age as Karl Rahner. Being born in Switzerland was important. He was born in the Catholic kind of section, if you want, of Switzerland. And especially when Catholicism is more of a minority religion, it tends to assert itself in a more bold way, let's say. So he grew up with a very energetic, confident, boldly expressed Catholicism. And that comes through in a lot of his writing throughout his career. As a young kid, his interest is not philosophy so much, as it often is for theologians. It's music. He became a devotee of Mozart as a young man and was quite an accomplished pianist. In fact, they say he could have pursued a career as a concertizing pianist. He knew Mozart so well that at one point in his young manhood, he gave away all his Mozart records. You ask why? The answer was because he had memorized them. He had that kind of orchestra conductor's memory for music. He goes into the university, and of course Germans to the present day don't so much go to a university, they go to a number of universities around the German-speaking world, and Balthasar did the same thing. His focus, though, was not philosophy, it was not religion. It was what the Germans call Germanistik. Germanistik is a study of the German language. It would combine elements of, grammar, of linguistics, of philosophy of language, and of German culture. It's kind of all woven into one. And that's what Balthasar does. He studies literature, basically, and philosophy of the aesthetic side of philosophy. His dissertation, his doctoral work, is on the eschatological problem, but in German literature, not so much in German theology or philosophy. So that very much shapes his approach to theology, which will be aesthetic rather than philosophical. When he is a young guy, he's about 22, he goes on a Ignatian retreat. And those who've been on Ignatian retreats know that the purpose of an Ignatian exercise is to clarify your vocation. And it really worked in the case of young Balthasar. He does the 30-day Ignatian retreat, at the end of which he decides he'll become a Jesuit priest. And so he joins the Jesuit novitiate and commences his long years of preparation. Now, at the time, 1920s, you're becoming a Jesuit, you would have studied the standard scholastic presentation of Thomas Aquinas. So young Balthasar gets that, and he said if that's all he ever received of theology, he would have left. He found it so dry and lifeless and really unconvincing. He had the good fortune, though, of being sent for further studies to Lyon, to a famous Jesuit theological center. And the director of studies there was a man just a little bit older than he, called Henri de Lubac, young Jesuit who was making a name for himself as one of the fathers of the ressourcement movement. That means back to the sources movement. So there were a number of people who said we're kind of stuck on this neo-scholastic reading of medieval philosophy and theology. Why don't we go back to the great pristine sources of the Christian life, namely the scriptures and the church fathers? So de Lubac became a patristic specialist. In fact, he's the editor of this massive and magnificent work called the Sources Chrétiennes, Christian Sources. Now it's a standard work in Catholic libraries all over the world. So the young de Lubac teaches the young Balthasar the fathers. We're talking here about Origen, about Chrysostom, about Jerome, about St. Augustine, about Maximus the Confessor, etc. And for Balthasar, this was like a breath of fresh air. It was like a new theological world, and he reveled in it. So think of the aesthetic background, music and Germanistique. Now think of this richly patristic background, and you're catching now some of the major influences on his later thinking. He's ordained a Jesuit priest, and he doesn't, despite his background, pursue a career in academics. It's very interesting. Balthasar never has a major teaching position in a university. Instead, he becomes a chaplain, a student chaplain, who gives the Ignatian exercises. Now, we saw the exercises had a big impact on him personally. Now he begins to give them, to direct people in them. Here's a third major influence on his thinking, is Ignatius of Loyola and the discernment of spirits. The Ignatian approach to the spiritual life becomes basic in his later theology. I'll just say a quick word about Adrienne von Speyr, who becomes a spiritual directee of his. She's a fascinating figure, complex, controversial character. But she was, by all accounts, a mystic. Balthasar thought she was one of the most extraordinary mystics in the history of the church, and had a number of experiences that he then helped her to interpret theologically. And she had a big impact on his thinking. It would take a whole other set of videos to explore that adequately, but she's another strong impact on his theological thought. In the 1950s, Balthasar becomes a great friend of Karl Barth. Karl Barth was the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century. Also from Basel, they were in the same city at this time. They became friends, not just intellectual interlocutors, but real friends. And Barth's thinking, and you know his approach, which was to be opposed to liberalism. The liberalism that came up from people like Friedrich Schleiermacher and others had shaped much of Protestant thinking. It began very much with human experience. It began with a turn toward subjectivity. And Barth calls the Protestant church back to a vibrant sense of the objectivity of biblical revelation. So again, we could do a semester course on Karl Barth. But that objectivity and the biblical focus become very strong themes for Balthasar as well. So that's still another strand that contributes to his theology. All this comes together in his masterpiece, and I'll refer to it now broadly, grandly, as the trilogy. The trilogy is made up of actually about a dozen books. The first set of books, in English we call them the Glory of the Lord. In German it's called Herrlichkeit. That means, it's got an ambiguous sense in German because Herrlichkeit, Herr means the Lord, but also Herrlichkeit means glory. So the English rendering Glory of the Lord catches that rather well. That's the first part of the trilogy. It's a consideration of beauty, and that's his route of access to theology. Second part, made up of about 5 volumes, is called the Theodramatik, or the Theodrama. Balthasar wanted to recover a sense of the dramatic character of the Christian life. It's very Ignatian. Ignatius, compels us to make a choice. You have to decide, are you in Satan's army, are you in Christ's army? And upon that decision, everything will follow. And so Balthasar wants to recover the dramatic quality, that it's a play between divine freedom and human freedom. And finally, the final volume is called the Theologic, or the Theologic. And now that's an articulation of the truth of the faith, but he's moved from the beautiful to the good to the true. And I'll say more about that in a following video. But that's his great trilogy, which becomes, in time, one of the recognized masterpieces of 20th century theology. Students begin to read it more carefully in the 60s and 70s, including a lot of Americans who came over to Europe to get their doctorates, and many to study with Karl Rahner, who became too busy with students. And he would say, go visit this man, this Hans Urs von Balthasar, who's brilliant and wonderful. So that's where a lot of students came from and began to study his work and to make it popular in this country. After Vatican II, so Balthasar is influential at Vatican II, certainly. He would have been associated with the more progressive elements of Vatican II, which include young Joseph Ratzinger and young Karol Wojtyła and de Lubac, his mentor, Danielu, Congar, many others. But then in the wake of the council, along with Ratzinger and de Lubac, he breaks with the standard reading of Vatican II, which you find in the Concilium group of theologians. They produced this journal called Concilium, meant to perpetuate the spirit of the council. Balthasar, Ratzinger, de Lubac break off, and they form a new journal called Communio. And it's very instructive to read his reflections on why he broke with Concilium. The bottom line was they felt that Concilium was pushing the church way beyond what the Ressourcement movement wanted. They wanted a recovery of the patristic, not so much an embrace of modernity, but a recovery of the patristic wealth of the church. Again, I'll say more about that in a follow-up video. But Balthasar emerges as you might say, a key member of the loyal opposition to the liberal establishment after Vatican II. Someone who comes very much under the influence of this Communio group is the now Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła. And so when Wojtyła becomes Pope, notice how all three of these people, de Lubac he names a cardinal, Ratzinger is already a cardinal, but he becomes head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And then Balthasar, John Paul tries several times to name him a cardinal. And Balthasar balked twice and said, no, I don't want that. And finally, the third time, John Paul insisted. So Balthasar in 1988 accepts the red hat. As he's preparing to go to Rome to get the red hat, he dies. And that led many of his followers to say, look, he didn't want it. Now it's very clear why. At his funeral, the eulogy is given by Joseph Ratzinger, who was his great colleague in these years after Vatican II. So it's no great surprise that under John Paul's papacy, when Ratzinger is his head of the doctrine of the faith, that Balthasar is brought very much to the fore. Another key figure in the Balthasar revival is Cardinal Schönborn, who becomes the general editor of the Catechism of 1992. And you read that text, you see a lot of Balthasarian themes. So that's a little overview, a little sketch of his life and times. In a follow-up video, I want to talk a bit more about his work. But urge everybody to dip into his work and get better acquainted with this very important theological figure.
Okay, that was, I think, a very fine introduction from Bishop Barron. If I may, I just have one quibble with one thing that he says in that video clip. He said, is really an aside, and again, this is just a quibble, but he said that, of course, von Balthasar was hugely influential at Vatican II. Actually, Hans wasn't there. Von Balthasar was not invited to Vatican II. He did not serve as a theological expert at Vatican II like Karl Rahner did, like Joseph Ratzinger did, like all of the other influential Catholic theologians of his day. He wasn't there. Von Balthasar left the Jesuits right before Vatican II, and so he had a bit of an irregular situation. He is going to ultimately found a religious community with Adrian von Speyer, but because he had just left the Jesuits and he didn't have a bishop and he was still forming this community, he was in a bit of an irregular situation, so von Balthasar was not at Vatican II and really had no impact there. So aside from that quibble, I think the video clip serves very well as an introduction to Hans Urs von Balthasar. All right, now what I'd like to do in this module for the rest of it is to present his theology of the descent of Christ into hell, his theology of Holy Saturday, and perhaps the best way to do so is to contrast it with the Christus Victor theology that we saw in the previous module in Module 6. Recall in the Christus Victor module that what happens there is that Christ basically goes down into the limbo of the fathers. He goes down to Hades to apply the fruits of salvation, the first fruits of salvation, won on the cross. According to Christus Victor theology, on the cross, salvation is won. On the cross, it's all finished. The "it is finished," the consummatum est, that Christ utters at the end of his suffering on the cross in the Gospel of John, this, according to Christus Victor theology, shows that salvation is complete with the death of Christ on the cross. And so because salvation is complete, the descent of Christ in the Christus Victor model is Christ going down and applying the first fruits of salvation. He's bringing the salvation won on the cross to those who are down in Hades, who died before and were awaiting the salvation that he came to bring. And so in Christus Victor theology, Christ descends into Sheol. He descends into what's really called the limbo of the fathers, and he applies the salvation won on the cross to Adam and Eve, to all the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets, to all those who were good and just men and women from the Old Testament, to all those who were awaiting Christ and awaiting his arrival with the salvation he came to bring on the cross. So notice in Christus Victor, Jesus only goes to the good and holy and just men and women of the Old Testament. He only goes to what's called the limbo of the fathers, to those Old Testament patriarchs and prophets and those who were awaiting Christ at the upper part of Hades, the limbo of the fathers, where the good Old Testament men and women were awaiting his arrival. The bad people, the wicked people, the damned, are down lower. They are not in the limbo of the fathers. They are down much lower in the fiery pit of Gehenna. They are much lower in, again, a place of suffering and punishment. The limbo of the fathers is more of a holding pen for all of the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets and the good people from the Old Testament who are awaiting Christ. And so Christ, after his death on the cross, brings salvation to them. He takes them up with him, and that, of course, is the basis for the very famous icon that we have seen quite a bit of in this course, Christ literally pulling up all of the good and holy Old Testament personages who died before his arrival. Now notice how active Christ is in Christus Victor theology. He descends into the underworld to bring salvation. He has some depictions of him kicking down the doors of hell. He literally marches in and conquers the underworld, conquers Satan like a conquering crusader marching through enemy territory. In Christus Victor theology, Christ is very active, and he brings with him the salvation won on the cross for all of the good people only, the Old Testament and those who died before he did. That is, in a nutshell, is Christus Victor. I don't want to push aside any of the details from the previous module, especially all those scriptural details and the other points I made in Module 6, but that's a summary of Christus Victor theology that will serve as a contrast to Balthasar's theology of the descent of Christ. For Balthasar, it's very different, his theology of the descent. First of all, when Jesus goes down to the underworld, for Balthasar, he's passive. He's not active. He's dead, Balthazar reminds us. He is dead, and as death signifies the end of all activity ceases upon death. So Balthazar begins by saying, this depiction of Christ going down and kicking down the doors and marching through hell, again, especially beloved in the Middle Ages, he said, really that has more to do with a mythic depiction, like Orpheus and the underworld, or Hercules going down to Hades. He said that's really too mythological for his taste. He sees Christ as, again, dead and so passive. We pray for the poor souls in purgatory because they cannot pray for themselves. Since they have died, they are passive. Balthazar reminds us that Christ has died, and so his descent into hell cannot be active or militaristic, or as a conquering hero storming the gates of hell. He goes down passive because he goes down to be among the dead as one who is dead. All right. This is really just the beginning of the difference, however, between Balthazar's theology of the descent and Christus Victor theology. And to grasp how different Balthazar's account is, we have to look at really his theology of the cross. For Balthazar, his understanding of what is going on when Jesus is on the cross, it's very different from the traditional understanding of Jesus on the cross. For Balthazar, what's happening on the cross is God the Father is actively loading all of the sin of the world onto Jesus. Now, where does Balthazar get that idea? He gets it from 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21, which says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now, what does the first part of that mean? That God made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin? It's a very mysterious line from St. Paul. It has bedeviled theologians for centuries. It's notoriously difficult to interpret. But Balthazar has a very striking interpretation of 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21. In fact, this is the heart of his theology of the descent. And you can see how important Scripture is to Balthazar's theology here. God made him who knew no sin to be sin. Balthazar says this actually starts on the cross. On the cross, the Father loads all the sin of all time, all the sin of every man, woman, and child, all the sin of those who ever lived, who ever will live. He loads all of the sin of mankind onto his Son. And Jesus, out of love for us, and out of love for the will of the Father, Jesus lovingly accepts all of this sin. He willingly receives it. It's not against his will. It's out of his complete love for us that he's willing to take on all of the sin of the world that the Father loads upon him, and that starts on the cross. On the cross, God the Father begins to make Jesus sin who knew no sin. Now, the traditional understanding of sin is that it's a defect, that it's a lack, it's a hole, it's an emptiness. Where there should be something, there is nothing, and that is the traditional understanding of sin. So how could God the Father load nothingness onto the Son? Well, see, Balthazar has a very different understanding of sin as well. He agrees with Aquinas that sin is a defect, it's a lack, it's an emptiness. But when mankind falls for temptation, when we listen to the lies of Satan, when we sin, we bring an energy into that. We interject an energy into that action. We bring a something into it. God does not. God does not make or create evil or sin. However, we do. Sin is a lack, it's an emptiness, but when we sin, we bring a positivity to it, in that sense of we bring something into it. We bring an energy into it by our sinful actions, and it takes on a kind of a perverted life of its own because of what we do and what we bring to it, the energy we give to it. So sin is a something for Balthazar. Of According to the classical tradition, sin is a lack. But Balthasar says, no, because of what we do, when we sin, we bring something, we interject an energy into it. So sin is a something. So this is what the Father loads onto the Son on the cross. All of the reality of sin, all of the energy, all of the substance that we generate by our sinful actions. This is what the Father loads onto the Son and what Jesus willingly takes on the cross. Now when he dies, according to Balthasar, this is what Jesus takes down with him. All of the sin of the entire world. Jesus drags this down with him down to Sheol. So notice, Jesus is not entering the underworld like this conquering hero. It's just the opposite. He descends passively, loaded up with all of the sin of all mankind. Out of love for us, he willingly takes all of this sin down with him, down to Sheol. So down in Sheol, Jesus has been made sin. He has all of the sin of the human race loaded onto him, and there he suffers the consequences of that sin for us down in Sheol. So the traditional understanding is that Christ took our place on the cross. He suffered physically on the cross for us the effects of sin. Balthasar agrees with that, but he extends it. He says that Jesus takes all of the sin loaded onto him down to Sheol, and there he suffers the consequences of sin for us, out of love for us, in our place, what we deserved. Because he loves us so much, he's willing to suffer the effects of sin down there for us. And what is the effect of sin? There's one word for it: God-forsakenness. God-forsakenness is the result of any sin, this alienation from God. Utter God-forsakenness. There's nothing more desolate than God-forsakenness. And this is what Jesus willingly suffers for us down in Sheol. Now, Balthasar goes into great detail in his book Mysterium Paschali, which is where his theology of Holy Saturday can be found in the main. He goes into great detail on what this God-forsakenness meant, felt like for the Son, for the Father who's willing to load all that sin on the Son, who's willing to accept it all for us. No one loves the Father like the Son, and no one loves the Son like the Father, and yet Jesus, out of love for us, is willing to take all of this on for us down there. He goes into great detail. I wish we could go into further detail. It's difficult, disturbing almost reading, though. But it shows the extent of Jesus' love for us, and it shows the reality of sin and what it cost even God. I'll say a little bit more about that when we come to the evaluation of Balthasar. But for now, let's just stay with the fact that Jesus is willing to suffer God-forsakenness, what we deserve, what we should suffer. He's willing to suffer that in our place down in the underworld. Notice I keep saying the underworld or Hades because according to Balthasar, hell as we know it does not really exist yet. Hell as we know it can't really be found in the Old Testament, and really it can't be found even in the New Testament. Hell as we know it. So we have in the Gospels, of course, the very famous story of the rich man who dies, and Lazarus who goes up to the bosom of Abraham, and the rich man is in torment. He's suffering in fire. He's suffering the effects of his wasted life. But even there, it's not hell as we understand it, because the rich man can converse with Father Abraham up in heaven, and back and forth they had that conversation, and he makes his request to send an angel. Father Abraham sent an angel to dip his tongue in water to cool his thirst. Because there's that back and forth communication, even though there's torment, obviously, it's still not hell as we understand it, which is final, in ultimate and complete separation with God. Balthasar says hell doesn't really exist as this final definitive choice until Jesus takes all of the sin of the world with him down to the underworld. And once he brings and drags all of this sin with him down there, now we're starting to have the context for hell. Now that all of the sin has been dragged down to the underworld. But what's required is now people have a choice. All those who died, the good, the bad, everybody who died before Christ, now they have a choice. Before the arrival of Christ, before the life and death and resurrection of Christ, no one had that choice, obviously. Balthasar says, now Christ, loaded up with sin, goes down to Sheol, and now everyone there who died before him can make the choice. They see the divine Son willing to suffer out of such love, passively suffering all of the effects of their sin and of all sin. And all those who died are able to witness this suffering of the divine Son in Sheol, and now they have a choice. Do they accept his love or do they reject it? Now they have the definitive choice. And Balthasar says it can be done. It can be done. This definitive rejection of the love of God, he holds that it is possible. It's not that everybody goes to heaven. It's not that everybody gets out of hell. Balthasar is not that simplistic of a thinker in the first place, and plus that would lead into a heresy that we'll see in the next module. So it is possible to maintain this definitive rejection against the love of God, but it's not easy. Balthasar will say. It's not easy to be that stubborn in our refusal of the love of God, but it can be done. For those who say no, they are the ones who then will be in hell. For those who say yes and accept the love of Christ, these are the ones that Christ brings with him come the resurrection. Not just the Old Testament good, not just the just men and women of the Old Testament. Jesus leads everyone out of the underworld, come the resurrection, who say yes and accept the offer of his love. For those who say no, and it can be done, Balthasar says, for those who say no, now they've made their definitive choice. Now there is hell. Now there is this utter and final rejection of the love of God, but no one's had the opportunity to make that choice before Christ descended. But come the resurrection, now people are able to say yes to God or no. Those who say yes, Christ brings up out of the underworld. Those who say no are now closed off in this final hell that is this ultimate rejection of God. So Balthasar says hell is really Christological. Hell is a result of saying no to the life, death, and suffering, love, and even resurrection of the Son of God. Notice also, what I think is really valuable here is this is salvation in Balthasar. Before, in the Christus Victor model, salvation happened on the cross. Once Christ died, salvation occurred, and Christ brings that salvation to those down in hell. Notice the resurrection is kind of not an afterthought, but it's definitely secondary in the Christus Victor model. Salvation is won on the cross, according to that theology. Balthasar says it's not on the cross, it starts there. You can't have salvation without the cross. But Balthasar locates salvation at the resurrection. Come the resurrection, those in Sheol, those in the underworld, now have a choice to go with Christ or to remain behind. The emphasis is on the resurrection in Balthasar's theology, which I think is a much more appropriate and even richer and more realistic and even true emphasis of where salvation occurs. If there was no resurrection, the cross would not in itself be salvific. The only reason there is salvation after Good Friday is because of the resurrection, something that Balthasar emphasizes in his theology of the descent. Again, it's a very dramatic, very different account than the Christus Victor theology that was presented in Module 6. But to return to a point that I alluded to earlier, but I'd like to deepen a bit, is I think what Balthasar's theology of the descent does is it shows how salvation is occurred really by how God destroys sin. God hates sin. God's wrath is directed against sin. But we see to what lengths God is willing to go in order to destroy sin to save us. We see in Balthazar's account just how much it cost God, just how much God hates sin, but also just to what extremes God is willing to go in order to save us from sin. You know, in the older account, in the Christus Victor model, and even in some medieval accounts, the question is, how does God save us from sin? Was answered, well, by saying, well, Jesus died on the cross. And that's true, of course. But the idea was, how does his death on the cross save us from sin? The answer came, well, he was a divine person. And so the death of a divine person is what took away sin. Well, how does the death of a divine person take away sin? The old idea was called penal substitution, that Christ suffered the punishment we deserve in our place. And penal substitution, Christ taking our place on the cross, a divine person dying out of love for us on the cross, that was thought to appease the anger of God and the wrath of God. Penal substitution was seen as appeasing the Father, appeasing God, making satisfaction, making things right, restoring justice. Where sin had upset the balance of justice, the death of the Son, the death of Jesus on the cross, I should say, restored the balance by paying the price for us, suffering in our place, thereby restoring justice, bringing salvation. But again, how does appeasing an angry God, again, this is the cruder version of it, but how does that bring about salvation from sin? Balthazar has an answer, where he has the Father loading all of that sin onto the Son, and then the Son dragging all of that sin down into Sheol, and there suffering all of the effects of sin for us. Now, again, this is going to get really complicated in Mysterium Paschale, but there's a Trinitarian dimension that Balthazar develops, and no one else has done this besides Hans Urs von Balthasar. He has a Trinitarian dimension to what Christ is suffering in Sheol. So in Sheol, we've had the Father loading all of the sin onto the Son willingly accepting it, and thereby willing to experience God-forsakenness for us. This has a Trinitarian dimension to it. I mean, the Father loves no one more than the Son, and yet the Father is willing to load all of the sin of the world onto the Son. The Father is willing to make him who knew no sin to be sin. The Father is willing to lose the Son to sin by making him into sin who did not know sin. The Father who loves Christ, who loves the Son more than anyone, yet is willing to push the Son that far away, willing to even lose the Son by loading all of the sin of the world onto him. The Father is willing to let go and to lose the one he loves most of all. Likewise, no one loves the Father like the Son. Jesus is willing to be abandoned by the Father. He is willing to receive all of the sin of the world. He's willing to let go of the one he loves the most, the Father, by taking on all of the sin of the world, by having all of the sin of the world loaded onto him. And yet somehow the Holy Spirit maintains this extreme push between the Father and the Son, just shy of the breaking point. Again, the Son willing to experience God-forsakenness. It goes into very deep and very rich and very powerful and, again, very unsettling Trinitarian theology, that the Father's willing to lose what he loves the most, the Son. That's what sin cost the Father. And the Son willing to take on all of the sin of the world, to suffer God-forsakenness, willing to be abandoned by the Father. My God, why did you abandon me? As Christ says on the cross, Balthasar takes that seriously, deadly seriously, earnestly, that the Son is willing to suffer abandonment, God-forsakenness. The Son is willing to lose what he loves the most, the Father. We can see what sin cost God, and we also can see the great extremes that God is willing to go to save us from it. That, again, in Sheol, the Trinity is willing to lose what it loves the most, each other, because of sin, in order to burn up the effects of sin down in Sheol. I know it's getting very dramatic there, but that's what Balthazar is trying to do, is restore the drama and help us to see what sin cost God, but also what it costs us, those of us who have fallen victim to sin. We see how, to what extent, to what great lengths God is willing to go in order to save us from all this. I think, again, Bishop Barron had a magnificent insight in that introductory video, that here in Balthazar's Theology of the Descent, we see the resolution of that classic conundrum in theology between St. Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus. St. Thomas, who held that God would not have become man if man had not sinned in the first place, and Scotus objecting, saying, no, God still would have done that out of his desire to manifest his glory. Instead, we see how Balthazar resolves both tensions. According to Balthazar, we see the real glory of God by seeing just how far God will go to save us from sin. So you see how Balthazar combines both theological strands in the tradition. The real glory of God is seen when we realize just how far, just to what extreme God is willing to go, that God is even willing to suffer this kind of alienation within himself in order to save us from that alienation. That even the Son is willing to suffer God-forsakenness to save us from that. When we see what God was willing to do to save us from sin, it reveals the glory of God. It's magnificent theology, what von Balthasar has given us. This is kenosis. This is self-emptying. The Father willing to let go and surrender what he loves the most, the Son, and the Son willing to be abandoned by the Father, willing to surrender his relationship with his Father. This is self-emptying to the utmost extreme. God can go no further than this. God can go no farther than what Balthasar has sketched for us in this Theology of the Descent. You know, in the Christus Victor model, the Son, Jesus, went down to the limbo of the fathers, but he stopped short. He didn't go down to the pits of hell. Balthasar thinks that that is stopping short, that God shows no desire to stop short, that God is willing to go to the furthest extreme imaginable, possible for God. God can go no farther than to suffer this God-forsakenness and all of the consequences of that, consequences of sin that we should suffer instead because of what we've done. Here we see that just how far God is willing to go. God can pursue us no farther. This is the bottommost point of how far God can pursue us. God can go no farther than this Theology of the Descent, but we know that it's just the turning point. This is the end point of God's descent, of God's condescension, of God's lowering himself. God can lower himself no farther than this, but it turns the corner come the resurrection. This downward movement to this extreme now turns upward, and come the resurrection, it is the upward movement, this upward return back to God. This is called deification, the process of our salvation, the process by which we are weaned from our sins and grow in holiness and become more and more like God. We're going to read a book after the intensive weekend called Deification and Grace that is going to chart the upward movement now for us as we continue throughout this course. But before we get to that book and before this weekend ends, there is a question that naturally arises. If God is willing to do this, to go this far, if Christ is willing to suffer this much for us, does this mean that everyone gets to be saved? I think you know the answer already because I've intimated it earlier in this module, but I want to sketch that out. I want to look at Balthasar's book, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved, in the next module, but I will save my comments for that. Thank you for your attention in this module. Please feel free to ask me any questions at the end of the weekend. You can email me and we'll try to process this a bit more. I know it's a lot. It's a lot of heavy, I think rich, but still heavy theology, especially the Trinitarian sections. But we're going to process that some more. But I want to, before we get to that, look at one more question. This notion, can we hope that all be saved? We'll do that in the next module. Thank you, and until then, goodbye.